Because when we act with courage, I mean, the definition of courage, as we know, is that you feel fear or discomfort and you do it anyway because it feels like the right thing to do. So acts of bravery are brave because there's fear. And when there's fear, there's a whole heck of a lot of vulnerability. So it seems like we can't act with courage without feeling vulnerable. So that's the edge we're going to explore this morning. So I'm going to share my screen. Is that true? Oh, I did just want to show you the picture. It'll be a quick share. These are some of the leaders that you spoke of this morning. Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, also put in prison, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Sister Teresa, Joan of Arc even came up on the list, and Harriet Tubman. And what we want to talk about today is you as a courageous leader. Courageous leaders are people who are able to push through uncomfortable situations. They're willing to make difficult decisions and not back down when things get too hard. So I'm going to share a video with you. How many of you have heard of Brene Brown? Just a show of hands. A couple of you. A couple of you in the Wolfpack group of Leadership Wyoming. I may have mentioned her when I came and did the Courageous Collaboration conversation with you. So there might be a little bit of repeat here, but not much. So Brene Brown is a social worker and a researcher, and she studies vulnerability, bravery, leadership, and the intersection of those. And she's being interviewed here on CBS, and I'm going to, it's like a 6-minute video. So what I'm going to do is just ask you to just jot down a few things that resonate with you as we're watching, and anything that jogs your thinking about courageous leadership for yourself. So, okay, can we see that? Okay.
We love, because you said vulnerability is not a weakness, that we should show it. I don't know anybody, Brene, that wants anybody to know they're feeling vulnerable or that it's an asset to whatever is going on in your life. And you say what?
Yeah, there's a lot of mythology about vulnerability, and the big one is that it's weakness.
Yeah.
And so from the data, the definition of vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And I had this like life-changing, career-changing moment standing in front of Special Forces, U.S. military, and I asked a question. Can anyone in this room give me an example of courage in your life or in someone else's life that didn't require uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure? And there was just silence until finally one guy stood up and said, 3 tours. There's no courage without vulnerability.
Yeah.
And we don't understand that vulnerability is the center of hard emotions, the stuff that we don't want to feel, especially at work. But it's also the birthplace of trust, love, belonging, courage.
You said you have to have vulnerability to be brave. Give us an example, because in your doc, you TikTok a lot of examples of vulnerability.
Yeah.
Like?
I mean, when we ask people, we've asked thousands of people, what is vulnerability? You hear everything from saying I love you first, the first date after my divorce, trying to get pregnant after my second miscarriage, you know, getting fired, firing someone, starting my own business. As a parent, the one that just killed me, I remember sitting across from this research participant, and she said, for me, vulnerability is sending my son to orchestra practice today, tryouts today, knowing how bad he wants to make first chair, and knowing he probably won't make the orchestra at all. Like, there is no courage without being all in. Like, if you can do something and not feel vulnerable, it's probably not that brave.
I think one of the hardest things in being vulnerable, which then leads to creativity, which then leads to success, as you say, the hardest part in taking that first step is fear of failure and fear of the critics. And I want to play part of this from your special because I think it really speaks to why many people never take that first step. Listen.
There are millions of cheap seats in the world today, filled with people who will never once step foot in that arena. They will never once put themselves out there, but they will make it a full-time job to hurl criticism and judgment and really hateful things toward us. And we have got to get out of the habit of catching them and dissecting them and holding them close to our hearts. We gotta let them drop on the floor. Don't grab that hurtful stuff from the cheap seats and pull it close. Don't pull it anywhere near your heart.
Easier said than done.
Oh God, for
You
me
say
too.
don't take criticism and feedback from people who are not being brave with their lives.
We can't. And here's the thing. Here's what I've discovered. If you sum up all the research over 20 years, everyone wants to be brave. No one wants to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And that is the rub. That is what will reconcile our entire adult lives, is how do I be brave with my life, with my work, with my partner, with my kids, and stay safe and armored at the same time? And the answer is you don't. And the cheap seats are like, in 22 years of doing this work, I've never seen the cheap seats like they are today.
Yeah.
Oh, Twitter is filled of
You call them cheap seats, I call them haters.
Now, is there no part of bravery that doesn't contain the sublimation of vulnerability? Because when you talk about 3 tours, when you talk about the people who are a champion for their bravery, some component of it often is they were fearful, vulnerable, they sublimated that and succeeded. I mean, is there no part of bravery that contains basically putting away your vulnerability?
I think it depends on how you define it. But if you define vulnerability as uncertainty and risk and emotional exposure, like we've asked probably 10,000 people that question. The week after I was with the service people, I went and I was doing some work with the Seattle Seahawks and asked them the same question. And they were just shocked for a second. They were like, no, every day on the field is vulnerable. So I think we can get used to being vulnerable a little bit. And maybe in that way, bravery becomes a practice and feels less scary. But I know for myself, every time I'm being brave, I feel scared.
Sure, and it's a common, performers talk about right before they go on stage to a part they've done a million times, they feel like they're about to die.
Yeah.
So it's there. I guess the question is for some people, if they turn inward to their vulnerability, they can get stuck in it. They can turn round and round. So what is the distinction between obsessing over your vulnerability and recognizing it, but being able to, or leap it in order to be successful? You
know what I think it is? It's a learned practice of discomfort. I have learned how to manage my discomfort. Physically, the physiology of vulnerability is real.
Right, that it's a sidecar to success, not an impediment to it.
I had a question last night that someone asked me in an audience, and she was kind of shaking and crying, and she said, I've got a book coming out, I'm scared to death, I don't know what to do, and this is how I feel. And I said, congratulations, this is what courage looks like.
Yeah, you said vulnerability is not about winning or losing, it's the courage to show up when you don't know the outcome. But this is one of my favorite things. You said, by choosing to be brave, you're going to get your beep kicked, you're going to fail, you're going to know heartbreak. Why would we make that choice? Who wants to get their butt kicked and who wants
experience heartbreak?
And it's a good question, but here's the problem. Hard things are born of vulnerability.
Yes.
Heartbreak, fear, grief, disappointment. But love, joy, belonging, intimacy, trust, creating, innovation are also born. So when we armor up to block the hard stuff, that armor keeps all of the experiences that bring meaning to our lives away as well.
I may be quoting you back to yourself, but not taking a risk is a risk itself.
Oh yeah, and can you imagine? I mean, this is like how I end the special, getting to the end of our lives and having to ask, what if I would have shown up?
Yeah.
What if I would have said yes? To me, that's more terrifying than putting myself out there.
That's why I say yes. Say yes.
Say yes.
Renee, after watching it, I texted.
Okay, we're going to stop there because then they just go into some chit chat that we don't need to hear. Yeah, thanks, Josh. It reminds Josh of Al Simpson's dialogue about risk. So I'm going to share a couple of slides and then we're going to get into breakout groups. So the key points that she made is that is around uncertainty, risk and discomfort, and emotional exposure. And she says there's no courage without vulnerability. I also want to share this, that when we talk about courage, there could be many aspects of courage. She's talking a lot about emotional courage, when we open ourselves to feel that full spectrum of feelings, both the joy and the happiness and the creativity that comes from making yourself vulnerable, but then also the hard feelings of feeling afraid and scared. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I start to feel vulnerable, my heart starts pumping faster. I get this nervous feeling in my stomach. And that's what she means about the physiological aspects of courage. You feel it. And she says in order to get better at this, we need to learn to manage those physiological aspects of courage in the moment. That's what she means. There's also social courage. This can involve the risk of embarrassment or having some repercussions from a peer group or a social group. If you think about some of the examples that you gave this morning around courageous leaders, Colin Kaepernick, for example, has displayed social courage. He stood up and did something that was socially unpopular at the time. And I'm guessing that history is being rewritten right now and that he is going to be a hero. For many of us, he already was, but now history is being rewritten right now. Moral courage, and this is about ethics, considering ethical dilemmas and doing the right thing. Intellectual courage. We deal a lot with this as leaders. You guys have talked about this already, our willingness to engage with new ideas, challenging ideas, to question our own thinking, intellectual courage. Physical courage, that's often what people think of first, is bravery at the risk of physical injury or death. Fortunately, most of your leadership positions will not involve this level of physical risk. You will be engaged probably in the first 4, mostly. And then there's spiritual courage. And this is the courage that fortifies us when we grapple with questions, those existential questions of life and meaning, and finding some courage spiritually. So I just wanted to share these because sometimes it helps to deconstruct words like courage. We hear it a lot. We hear bravery a lot. We hear vulnerability. And so these types of courage can help us kind of get in to figuring out what actually is going on here. What is being put at risk if you do a certain action? So I'm going to ask that we take these questions into breakout groups. And we want to give you a good chunk of time this morning in breakout groups, about 20-25 minutes. Where in your work or in your leadership are you being asked to be brave right now? What's at risk? Because remember, if we're not feeling that there's a risk, it's probably not that brave. It's just leadership. So what's at risk? We want to invite you to talk about a place that you feel vulnerable as a leader right now, because you're being asked to be brave. There's something at risk. And if there's a particular type of courage that you feel is being tugged on, what might that be? I'm going to give you an example, something that happened to me just last Friday. And it has to do with my work as a facilitator. I was asked to facilitate a group of white folks who wanted to debrief racism and talk about racism and talk about white, what does it mean to be a white ally? What does it mean to be white in this country? And it was for an organization that was having other conversations at the same time for people of color. And this is a technique that's called race-based caucusing. It is a thing. I've participated in it. I've facilitated it before. I've done about, several years of study into the history of Blacks in this country, of Indigenous people, and other Asian, Chinese, Japanese, they're Latinx folks. So I was asked to facilitate this. And I thought, okay, I'm being asked to do this work. And it makes me feel very vulnerable because these are hard conversations. And what's at risk for me is that I will say something that is perceived as racist or is racist, and then therefore harmful. And that feels to me like, the word facilitator means to make things easy. And if I go ahead and do harm through my very work, that to me feels like a social risk that I'll be, it'll ruin my reputation of my work. And something that happened during the meeting is there were 200 people on this Zoom meeting. It was crazy. I couldn't hold the energy. I just couldn't find a way to do it. And during this meeting, one woman basically hijacked the agenda. She said, I'm going to read this statement. I'm going to take 5 minutes and I'm going to do this thing. And she started. And immediately my heart was thumping. I was like, oh God, what do I do as a facilitator? I had my finger on the mute button, but I didn't push it. And I had to make these decisions in the moment. It was like I was sitting there, sitting with my discomfort, in a really live way, and everybody else was as well. And we resolved it. I'm not going to tell you how right now, because what I want you to do is to talk about something like that in your workplace. What is a time that you felt vulnerable, like right now? What's at risk? And what do you do with that feeling? What do you do with that vulnerability and the courageous action that you're being asked to take, right? So think about the Brene Brown video, think about what stood out for you there, the different types of courage, and go ahead and get into breakout groups, and we'll see in about